Today's story begins inside a hospital, where a black patient is quietly denied treatment because his insurance isn't enough. Weeks later, fate turns the tables, when the very doctor who turned him away is fighting for his life, and the only organ that can save him comes from the man he once refused to help. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe one life can change an entire system. The emergency department at St. Mark's Medical Center never truly slept. Even at dawn, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, monitors beeped in uneven rhythms, and the smell of antiseptic clung to the air like a warning. It was here, on a narrow gurney pushed against a pale blue wall, that Elijah Carter waited, hands folded over his abdomen, breathing shallow, eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles as if they might offer answers. He was 32, but the pain had aged him. Weeks of nausea, months of exhaustion. Tonight, the ache in his side had sharpened into something he could no longer ignore. A co-worker had driven him here after Elijah nearly collapsed at the warehouse. "Just get checked," the man had said. "At least hear what they tell you." Elijah believed in that, hearing what people told you, even when you already suspected the truth. A nurse stopped at the foot of the bed, clipboard in hand. She was kind but hurried, the way kindness became when time was scarce. "We're running labs," she said. "The doctor will be in shortly." Elijah nodded. "Thank you." He always said thank you. He'd learned early that gratitude softened rooms that weren't built for you. Minutes stretched, then more. The curtain rustled, and a man stepped inside with the certainty of someone used to command. Dr. Andrew Whitman, mid-40s, white coat pressed, tie perfectly aligned. He scanned the chart before looking at Elijah, eyes sharp, assessing, already calculating. "Mr. Carter," Dr. Whitman said, not unkindly, but without warmth. "I've reviewed your intake." Elijah pushed himself up a little. "Doctor, Your labs indicate chronic liver disease," Whitman continued, flipping a page. "You've been symptomatic for some time." Elijah swallowed. "I didn't have insurance before. I do now. It's basic, but—" Dr. Whitman raised a hand. Not harsh, efficient. "Your coverage doesn't meet the requirements for the diagnostic imaging and specialty care you'll need here." The words landed cleanly, like a stamp pressed onto paper. Elijah blinked. "I'm in pain," he said quietly. "I can't keep food down. I work nights. I just need help." Whitman glanced back to the chart. "We can stabilize you. Pain management, fluids, but ongoing treatment, specialist referrals, those aren't approved under your plan." A nurse shifted behind Whitman, eyes flicking between them. She said nothing. Elijah's voice stayed calm. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying," Whitman replied, finally meeting Elijah's gaze, "that this facility cannot provide the level of care your condition requires without adequate insurance authorization." For a moment, the sounds of the ER faded. The beeping monitors seemed distant, like echoes in a tunnel. Elijah nodded once. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask to speak to someone else. He'd learned what happened when you did. "I understand," he said. Whitman exhaled, relieved, perhaps not consciously, but visibly. "We'll discharge you with instructions for follow-up at a county clinic." "When?" Elijah asked. "When an appointment becomes available." Elijah absorbed that. He thought of the waiting lists, the months, the way pain didn't care about calendars. "Doctor," he said, choosing his words carefully, "if I leave tonight, will I be okay?" Whitman hesitated. Just a fraction. Then the professional mask settled back into place. "I can't predict outcomes," he said, "but you're stable enough to be discharged." Stable enough. Elijah looked down at his hands. They were trembling now, just slightly. He pressed them together to stop it. The nurse stepped forward. "I'll get your paperwork," she said softly. As she turned away, Elijah felt the weight of the room shift. He was no longer a patient. He was a problem being processed. Dr. Whitman paused at the curtain. "Mr. Carter," he said, "this is the system. I don't make the rules." Elijah looked up. His eyes were tired, but steady. "I know," he replied. Whitman nodded and left. The discharge was efficient. A printed packet, a list of clinics, a bus route scribbled in pen. The nurse avoided Elijah's eyes as she removed the IV. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Elijah smiled faintly. "It's okay." He changed back into his hoodie and jeans, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. When he stood, the room tilted. He steadied himself against the bed rail until the world leveled again. In the hallway, he passed other rooms, curtains drawn, voices rising and falling. Somewhere, someone was being saved. Somewhere else, someone was being told to wait. Outside, Los Angeles was waking up. Sirens in the distance, a bus sighing at the curb. Elijah stepped into the cool morning air and pulled his hood up, though the sun was already climbing. He sat on a bench across from the hospital entrance and unfolded the discharge papers. The words blurred. He folded them back up. Across the glass doors, he saw Dr. Whitman moving briskly down the corridor, already onto the next case. Another chart, another decision, another life sorted into the proper column. Elijah stood slowly and began the walk to the bus stop. Each step sent a dull ache through his side. He breathed through it, counting his steps, focusing on the pavement. He didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything split, before and after. The moment a signature and a sentence would echo far beyond this morning. If this story has pulled you in, take a second to subscribe and stay with us. Leave a comment if you've ever seen how a single decision can change a life. Because what happened next, what happened later, would force the system to confront the cost of that choice. The bus lurched forward with a mechanical sigh as Elijah Carter took a seat near the back, gripping the metal pole until the dizziness passed. The hospital faded behind him through the smudged window. White walls, glass doors, a place built to heal, now shrinking into the distance like it had already forgotten him. The discharge papers rested on his lap, folded neatly, untouched. Around him, the city was waking up. A woman in scrubs scrolled through her phone. A man in a construction vest nodded off, hard hat pressed against the window. Two teenagers laughed loudly near the front. Life moved on, indifferent and relentless. Elijah stared at his reflection in the glass. His skin looked dull, his eyes ringed with shadows he couldn't remember earning all at once. He thought about the word Dr. Whitman had used, stable. It sounded solid, safe. But Elijah knew better. Stable didn't mean healed. Stable didn't mean treated. Stable just meant not dead yet. The bus dropped him near his apartment just after sunrise. The building was a squat, aging structure tucked between a tire shop and a closed-down laundromat. Paint peeled from the walls like old scabs. The stairwell smelled faintly of damp concrete and bleach. Elijah climbed the steps slowly, pausing every few flights to catch his breath. When he reached his unit, he leaned his forehead against the door for a moment before unlocking it. Inside, the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. He lowered himself onto the couch and let the silence settle. The pain in his side pulsed dully, like a warning bell that never stopped ringing. Elijah worked that night anyway. The warehouse didn't care about doctor visits or discharge papers. Boxes still needed moving. Orders still needed filling. When his supervisor saw him clutch his side, he frowned. "You sure you're good?" the man asked. Elijah forced a smile. "I'm good." He wasn't lying. Not exactly. He was good enough to keep going, and that was all that ever seemed to matter. The hours dragged. His hands shook when he lifted heavier boxes. Sweat soaked through his shirt, cold against his skin. By midnight, nausea rolled through him in waves, but he swallowed it down with water and stubbornness. During his break, Elijah sat alone on a crate and pulled out his phone. He opened the list of clinics the hospital had given him and started dialing. One number went to voicemail. Another placed him on hold. A third disconnected mid-call. At the county clinic, a tired voice finally answered. "Next available appointment is in 6 weeks." 6 weeks? Elijah repeated softly. "Yes, sir." He thanked her and hung up. 6 weeks might as well have been 6 years. Days blurred together after that. Elijah slept in fragments, worked in stretches, and lived in the spaces between pain and exhaustion. He lost weight. His appetite vanished. Sometimes he caught himself staring into space, the world dimming at the edges. Still, he kept showing up, because showing up was what kept the lights on. Across town, Dr. Andrew Whitman moved through his days with precision. His mornings began early, coffee brewed just right, tie knotted cleanly, white coat waiting on the back of the chair. At St. Mark's Medical Center, his name carried weight. Residents straightened when he entered a room. Administrators trusted his judgment. He performed his rounds, reviewed cases, signed off on decisions that shaped lives, often without ever seeing the faces attached to the files. Elijah Carter's name never crossed his mind again. To Whitman, the ER encounter had been routine, a patient without sufficient coverage, a necessary discharge, the system functioning as designed. At home, Whitman ate dinner alone in a quiet kitchen, scrolling through emails while the news murmured in the background. Stories of overcrowded hospitals, staffing shortages, policy debates. He skimmed them all. It wasn't his job to fix the system, he told himself, only to operate within it. Weeks passed. Elijah's body began to fail him in ways he could no longer hide. One night at work, his vision blurred suddenly, the room spinning. He dropped to one knee, boxes crashing around him. "Hey!" someone shouted. "Call 911." This time, there was no polite discharge, no clipboard, no quiet hallway. Elijah woke up in a different hospital, lights harsh and unforgiving. Machines surrounded him, monitors screaming their concern in sharp beeps. A doctor leaned over him, voice urgent. "You're in liver failure," she said. "Advanced. You should have been under care months ago." Elijah tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his tongue heavy. "We're doing what we can," she continued. "But you need to understand. You'll need a transplant." The word hung in the air. "Transplant," Elijah whispered. "Yes," the doctor said gently. "A liver transplant." Elijah closed his eyes. He thought of the waiting lists he'd heard about, the costs, the requirements. "I don't have family that matches," he said quietly. "And I don't have money." The doctor's expression softened. "We'll run tests, see what's possible." Elijah nodded, already feeling the weight of inevitability settle over him. Over the next few days, he drifted in and out of consciousness. Tests were run. Consults whispered outside his room. Nurses came and went, some kind, some hurried, all bound by limits they couldn't cross. One afternoon, a transplant coordinator sat by his bed. "You're eligible to be listed," she said carefully, "but the wait could be long." Elijah listened. He understood what she wasn't saying. Long meant uncertain. Uncertain meant unlikely. That night, alone in his room, Elijah asked for the forms. "What forms?" the nurse asked. "The donor paperwork," Elijah replied. She hesitated. "You're very sick. You should focus on getting better." Elijah looked at her, eyes steady despite the weakness in his body. "If I don't," he said softly, "I want it to mean something." The nurse nodded slowly and brought the papers. With trembling hands, Elijah signed his name. He didn't know who might receive his liver. He didn't imagine their face or their life. He only knew this: if his time ran out, he refused to let the system take everything without giving something back. Across the city, Dr. Whitman attended a gala fundraiser for the hospital. He shook hands, accepted praise, spoke about advancements in transplant medicine. He spoke confidently. He spoke comfortably. He had no idea that somewhere, in a quiet room filled with machines, a man he once sent away was making a choice that would soon circle back, violent, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. If you're still with us, subscribe and stay close. Leave a comment if you've ever seen how easily a life can be pushed aside, because in the next scene, the balance will begin to shift and the roles will start to reverse. Time no longer moved in days for Elijah Carter. It moved in lab results, medication schedules, and the soft rhythm of machines that reminded him he was still here, at least for now. The hospital room was dim, curtains half drawn to keep the afternoon sun from overheating his fragile body. His skin had taken on a faint yellow tint, subtle but unmistakable. His hands lay atop the thin blanket, veins pronounced, fingers slightly swollen. Every breath felt heavier than the last, like his chest was carrying a weight it could no longer support. A nurse adjusted his IV and checked the monitor. "How's the pain today?" Elijah considered the question. Pain had become a constant companion, sometimes loud, sometimes distant, but always present. "Manageable," he said. She smiled, knowing what that word really meant. "I'll be back in a bit." When she left, the room fell quiet, except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Elijah turned his head toward the window. From the 6th floor, he could see a slice of Los Angeles, cars crawling along the street, people crossing intersections, lives unfolding without him. Waiting was the hardest part, not the needles, not the weakness. Waiting. Waiting to see if a match would come. Waiting to see if his body would hold out long enough. Waiting to learn whether the choice he'd made, to donate his organs if things went wrong, would ever matter. The transplant coordinator visited again that evening. She pulled up a chair, her face careful, professional. "You're officially on the list," she said, "but I want to be honest with you." Elijah nodded. "Please." "Your condition is severe," she continued, "and the wait times, they can be long." "How long?" Elijah asked. She hesitated. "Weeks, months, sometimes longer." Elijah looked down at his hands. "I don't think I have months." She didn't argue. "We'll do everything we can," she said softly. After she left, Elijah closed his eyes. He thought about his mother, gone years ago, about his father, a name he barely remembered, about the warehouse, the long nights, the way he'd always believed if he worked hard enough, things would even out. He thought about the hospital he'd first gone to, the clean floors, the efficient dismissal. He didn't feel anger, just tiredness. Across the city, Dr. Andrew Whitman sat in his office reviewing charts. The day had been long. His temples throbbed faintly, but he ignored it. Headaches were part of the job. A resident knocked lightly and entered. "Dr. Whitman, radiology is ready to discuss the new transplant protocols." "Send them in," Whitman said, rubbing his forehead briefly before straightening. Meetings followed meetings. Discussions about organ allocation, ethics, logistics. Whitman spoke with authority, citing statistics and survival rates. His voice was steady, confident, practiced. He was the kind of man people trusted with life and death decisions. But late that night, alone in his office, Whitman felt something unfamiliar, a sudden wave of nausea. He stood too quickly, the room tilting. He steadied himself against the desk, breathing through it. Probably stress, he told himself. He went home early. The symptoms didn't go away. Over the next week, fatigue crept into Whitman's days. He found himself short of breath climbing stairs, his appetite fading. His skin looked pale in the mirror, shadows forming beneath his eyes. Colleagues noticed. "You look exhausted," one nurse remarked. "Just a rough week," Whitman replied. He ordered labs on himself, routine, precautionary. When the results came back, he stared at the screen longer than he should have. Elevated liver enzymes, concerning levels. He ran them again. Worse. The irony didn't register at first. He told himself there was a reasonable explanation. He scheduled imaging, consulted a colleague he trusted. The diagnosis came quietly, devastating in its simplicity. Acute liver failure. Whitman sat across from the consulting physician, hands folded tightly. "That's not possible," he said. "I don't drink excessively. I don't have risk factors." "Sometimes," the physician replied gently, "there aren't clear reasons." Whitman swallowed. "Treatment?" "We'll try medical management," she said. "But if your liver continues to decline—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Transplant. The word echoed differently now. Back in his office, Whitman closed the door and sat alone. For the first time in his career, the hospital felt different. Not a workplace, but a maze he could get lost in. He thought about wait lists, about insurance approvals, about criteria. He thought about being stable enough. At the other hospital, Elijah's condition worsened. One morning, he woke confused, disoriented, the world swimming. A nurse rushed in, calling for a doctor. Tests were run again, faces tightening as numbers came back. "He's deteriorating," someone whispered. Elijah drifted in and out, catching fragments of conversation. Encephalopathy. Time-sensitive. Unlikely without transplant. When he was lucid, he asked one question. "Has there been a match?" The answer was always the same. Not yet. That night, Elijah asked the nurse to help him sit up. It took effort. His muscles felt like they no longer belonged to him. "I signed the donor papers," he said softly. "I want to make sure they're in my file." The nurse nodded, eyes shining. "They are." Elijah leaned back against the pillows, exhausted. "If I don't make it," he continued, voice barely above a whisper, "promise me they won't waste it." She squeezed his hand. "I promise." Across Los Angeles, Dr. Whitman lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. His abdomen ached dully. Fear crept in. Not dramatic, not loud, but insistent. He, too, had been told to wait. Wait and see. Wait and hope. Wait and trust the system. For the first time, Whitman wondered how many people he'd asked to do the same, without ever knowing what waiting cost. The night stretched on for both men, separated by miles, connected by a system that had already begun to turn its gears. Neither of them knew it yet. But the list was about to deliver an answer that would bind their lives together in a way no policy, no insurance plan, and no justification could undo. If this story is gripping you, subscribe and stay with us. Leave a comment if you've ever seen how waiting can be the most dangerous part of all. Because in the next scene, the roles will reverse, and the system will reveal its cruel symmetry. The first thing Dr. Andrew Whitman noticed when he was admitted to St. Mark's Medical Center wasn't the pain. It was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the heavy, clinical silence that settled when doors closed and decisions were made without you in the room. The same halls he had walked for years with confidence now felt narrower, colder, unfamiliar. Whitman lay in a private room, pale sheets pulled up to his waist, an IV threaded into his arm. His white coat was gone. In its place was a thin hospital gown that offered no authority, no protection. Just exposure. A nurse entered quietly, checking his vitals. She was efficient, professional, polite in the same way people often were with him. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Whitman considered the question. He had asked it countless times himself. Now it sounded different. He felt weak, foggy, afraid. "I've been better," he replied. She nodded and adjusted the monitor. "The attending will be in shortly." Attending. The word struck him. For the first time, he wasn't the one being waited on. He was the one waiting. When the attending physician arrived, Whitman recognized her immediately. Dr. Linda Morris, a colleague, an equal, someone who had once sought his approval on complex cases. Now she stood at the foot of his bed, chart in hand. "Andrew," she said gently, "I won't sugarcoat this." Whitman swallowed. "I'd expect nothing less." "Your liver function is declining faster than we hoped," she continued. "Medical management isn't enough." Whitman closed his eyes briefly. He already knew what was coming. "You'll need to be evaluated for a transplant," Morris said. "And soon." The word landed like a verdict. Transplant. Whitman opened his eyes. "I understand the process," he said. "The criteria. The wait list." "Yes," Morris replied. "You do." That was the cruelest part. Whitman knew too much. He knew the statistics, the mortality rates, the average waiting times, the variables that could tip a patient from priority to pending. He knew how often patients waited too long, and for the first time, that knowledge offered no comfort. Over the next few days, Whitman was transferred to a monitored unit. Blood was drawn constantly. Imaging ordered. Specialists consulted. His name was entered into the transplant system, not as a physician, but as a patient. He watched the process from the inside. The questions, the forms, the insurance verifications. Even for him, things took time. One afternoon, a transplant coordinator sat beside his bed, her tablet balanced on her knee. "You meet the medical criteria," she said. "Your case will be reviewed by the committee." Whitman nodded. "And the wait?" She hesitated. "It's unpredictable." He almost laughed. Unpredictable. The word he'd used so many times. When she left, Whitman stared at the ceiling. His body ached in unfamiliar ways. His thoughts drifted to his career, his reputation, the certainty he had once worn like armor. And then, unbidden, another thought surfaced. A man on a gurney, a hoodie, a quiet voice asking if he'd be okay. Whitman pushed the memory aside. At another hospital across the city, Elijah Carter hovered on the edge between awareness and darkness. His condition had deteriorated sharply. His skin was deeply jaundiced now, eyes dull, body swollen with fluid. The doctors spoke in hushed tones outside his room. "He's running out of time. We need a match, soon." Elijah drifted in and out, barely conscious. When he woke, he often didn't know where he was. Names slipped away, faces blurred. But one thing remained clear. He wasn't afraid. When the nurse asked him if he was in pain, he nodded slightly. When she asked if he wanted more medication, he shook his head. "I want to be awake," he whispered. "For what?" she asked gently. Elijah took a long breath. "In case there's news." Back at Estine Marks, Whitman's decline accelerated. His hands trembled. His mind fogged. The irony was no longer theoretical. It was physical, undeniable. He overheard a conversation in the hallway one evening. Two residents spoke quietly, unaware he was awake. "He's lucky," one said. "Good insurance, top tier." The words cut deeper than Whitman expected. Lucky. He turned his face toward the window. The city lights blurred through tears he hadn't planned to shed. For the first time, he understood how thin the line was between privilege and desperation. Late that night, his phone buzzed with a message from the transplant coordinator. Potential match identified. Whitman's heart raced. The coordinator arrived moments later, her expression serious. It's preliminary, she said, but the donor appears to be a strong match. Whitman nodded, afraid to breathe. She continued, the donor is registered. Consent is in place. Whitman swallowed. Who is it? She hesitated, just long enough. Then she turned the tablet toward him. Elijah Carter. The room seemed to tilt. Whitman stared at the name, the age, the blood type. The memory surged back with brutal clarity. The ER curtain, the discharge papers, the words insurance doesn't meet requirements. This, his voice broke. This can't be real. The coordinator's eyes were gentle, but unyielding. The match is rare. If the organs are viable, this could save your life. Whitman leaned back against the pillows, breath shallow, chest tight. The man he had sent away. The patient he had deemed unworthy of care. Now the system was offering him that man's final gift. In that moment, Dr. Andrew Whitman understood something he never had before. The system he had defended did not forget. It waited, and it had just handed him the bill. If you're still with us, subscribe and leave a comment, because in the next scene, the story will reach its most painful crossroads, where survival and conscience collide, and a decision must be made that no training can prepare you for. The name stayed on the screen long after Dr. Andrew Whitman stopped reading it. Elijah Carter. 32 years old, blood type compatible, rare, near-perfect match. Whitman's hands trembled as he lowered the tablet back onto the tray. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thinner, as if the hospital itself were pressing in on him. This isn't a coincidence, he whispered. The transplant coordinator stood quietly at his bedside. She had delivered news like this before, news that shattered families, news that saved lives. She knew when to speak and when silence carried more weight. There are no coincidences in matching, she said carefully, only probabilities. Whitman let out a hollow breath. I remember him. The words surprised even him. He came into my ER, Whitman continued, voice low. He was in pain. He needed help. The coordinator nodded once. Yes. And I sent him away. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. Her role wasn't to judge, only to facilitate. The donor consented voluntarily, she said, long before his condition worsened. His wishes are clear. Whitman closed his eyes. He saw it again, the narrow gurney, the folded hands, the quiet acceptance in Elijah's voice. Will I be okay? Whitman had answered like a professional, like a man protected by distance and policy. I need a moment, Whitman said. The coordinator stepped back. I'll give you time, but we're on a clock. When she left, Whitman lay staring at the ceiling, memories bleeding into one another. Years of training had taught him to compartmentalize, emotion here, decision there. But now, the walls between them were gone. Across the city, in a dim room filled with machines, Elijah Carter slept. His breathing was shallow, irregular. The yellow tint of his skin was pronounced now, his body swollen with fluid. A nurse adjusted his blankets and brushed a curl of hair from his forehead. Elijah, she said softly, can you hear me? His eyes fluttered open for a moment. You're still with us, she said gently. Elijah managed the faintest nod. There's been a development, the nurse continued. I can't share details yet, but things are moving. Elijah's lips parted. Okay, he whispered. That was all he said. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask when. He didn't ask why. Somewhere deep inside, he had already let go of the need to know. Back at St. Mark's, Whitman called for his attending. Dr. Morris arrived quickly, concern etched into her face. Andrew, what's going on? Whitman swallowed hard. The donor. I know him. She stiffened. From where? From the ER, Whitman replied. Weeks ago. He came in sick, underinsured. I discharged him. The room went quiet. Morris exhaled slowly. Andrew. I didn't treat him, Whitman said, the words scraping his throat. I followed protocol, but if I had acted sooner, if I had pushed… You can't rewrite the past, Morris said gently, but you can decide how to face what's happening now. Whitman looked at her, eyes shining. Am I allowed to accept this? Morris hesitated. Ethically? The donor consented freely. Legally, there's no barrier. But morally, she met his gaze. That's yours to answer. Whitman nodded, heart pounding. If I accept, am I stealing his chance? Morris shook her head. There is no chance left to steal. This is about honoring his choice. Whitman leaned back, exhausted. He deserves better than this. He chose this, Morris reminded him, and that matters. Whitman stared at the wall, the weight of her words settling slowly. That night, Whitman asked for Elijah's file. He read every line. The warehouse job, the missed appointments, the clinic wait lists, the donor consent signed in a shaky hand. At the bottom of the page, a note from a nurse caught his eye. Patient expressed desire for donation to help someone, even if he could not be saved. Whitman's chest tightened. In the early hours of the morning, the transplant coordinator returned. We need your decision, she said quietly. If the organs remain viable, surgery will proceed soon. Whitman looked at her, then down at his hands, hands that had once signed discharge orders without a second thought. I don't deserve this, he said. The coordinator's voice was steady. Deserving isn't part of the equation. Whitman closed his eyes. I will accept, he said finally, but only if his family, if there is anyone, knows that his life mattered, that his decision saved someone. She nodded. I'll make sure they're told. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, Elijah's condition worsened rapidly. Alarms sounded softly, nurses moving with practiced urgency. A doctor spoke to him, though it was unclear how much he understood. Elijah, she said, we're here. He didn't respond. Minutes later, a time was recorded. The room fell still. Across town, Whitman was prepped for surgery. As they wheeled him toward the operating room, the world blurred. He caught glimpses of familiar ceilings, lights he'd once passed beneath with confidence. Now, they felt unforgiving. Just before the doors closed, Whitman whispered to no one in particular, I'm sorry. The surgery would be long, the outcome uncertain. But one truth was already fixed. A man once deemed not enough had become the only reason another man might live. If this story is holding you, subscribe and stay with us. Leave a comment if you believe some lives speak louder in silence. Because in the next scene, the cost of survival will be paid, and the consequences will begin to unfold. The operating room lights burned brighter than anything Dr. Andrew Whitman could remember. He lay flat on the narrow table, arms outstretched, chest rising and falling beneath sterile sheets. The ceiling tiles passed overhead as he was wheeled into position, each one a reminder of how many times he had stood on the other side of this moment, masked, gloved, in control. Now, control belonged to someone else. Andrew, a voice said softly. Morris leaned into his line of sight, her eyes calm above the surgical mask. We're about to begin. Whitman nodded. His mouth felt dry. Before you do, he said, voice hoarse, I need to ask something. She paused. Go ahead. Was he afraid? The question hung in the sterile air. Morris understood immediately who he meant. No, she said gently. He was very calm. He asked us to make sure nothing was wasted. Whitman closed his eyes. That was worse than fear. As anesthesia crept through his veins, Whitman's thoughts scattered, memories colliding in fragments. Elijah's quiet voice, the ER corridor, the word stable. He felt himself slipping, consciousness dissolving into darkness, carrying with it a single, crushing realization. He would live because Elijah would not. Hours later, another operating room, different floor, different team, stood ready. Elijah Carter lay still, machines breathing for him, his body now silent in a way that left no doubt. A nurse stood at his side, one hand resting lightly on his arm. "You did good," she whispered. "You mattered." The surgery began. 2 lives intersected under bright lights and steady hands, one ending, one continuing. When Whitman woke, it was to the sound of steady beeping, not frantic, not urgent, controlled, alive. Pain radiated through his abdomen, sharp and undeniable, but beneath it was something else, a strange, unfamiliar strength. His body felt altered, foreign, as if it carried a presence he couldn't name. Dr. Morris appeared at his bedside later that day. Her eyes smiled above the mask. "It was successful," she said. "The graft took." Whitman exhaled, a sound that was half relief, half grief. "And Elijah?" he asked, though he already knew. Morris's expression softened. "He saved you." The words pierced deeper than any incision. Whitman turned his face toward the window. Outside, the city continued, cars moving, people walking, unaware of the exchange that had just taken place within these walls. Over the following days, Whitman's recovery was monitored closely. Nurses checked vitals. Residents reviewed labs. Each improvement was noted with cautious optimism. But Whitman felt no celebration. At night, when the room was quiet and the pain medication dulled his body, but not his mind, guilt crept in. Not the sharp guilt of accusation, but the slow, suffocating kind that pressed against his chest. He replayed the moment he'd dismissed Elijah, the ease with which he'd said no, the confidence he'd felt in the system. Now, that system had placed Elijah's life into his hands, without ever giving Elijah the same courtesy. Whitman requested Elijah's belongings. A nurse returned with a small plastic bag. Inside were a worn wallet, a set of keys, a folded bus pass, and the hoodie Elijah had worn when he first came to the ER. Whitman picked up the hoodie. The fabric was soft from years of use, frayed at the cuffs. He pressed it lightly to his chest, his breath hitching. "I should have helped you," he whispered. Days later, Whitman was strong enough to walk the halls, slowly, carefully, guided by a physical therapist. Staff greeted him with polite smiles, congratulations murmured under their breath. "You're lucky," someone said. The word landed like a slap. Lucky. Whitman stopped walking. "Excuse me," he said quietly, but firmly. The nurse turned, surprised by the intensity in his eyes. "I'm alive," Whitman said, "because someone else died. That isn't luck." The nurse nodded, chastened. "I'm sorry." Whitman continued on, each step heavy. He began to ask questions about Elijah's care, about the clinic referrals, about the delays. What he learned sickened him. The county clinic had a 6-week wait. The referral process had stalled. The insurance requirements had slowed everything. No single failure, just a chain of them, a chain Whitman had helped forge. One afternoon, Whitman asked to see the transplant committee. When they gathered in the conference room, some looked confused, others cautious. "I'm not here as a physician," Whitman said, standing slowly. "I'm here as a patient who benefited from this system, and as a doctor who failed within it." The room went still. "Elijah Carter was turned away from my ER," Whitman continued, "not because his condition wasn't serious, but because his insurance wasn't sufficient." A murmur rippled through the room. "He later became my donor," Whitman said, voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "And I will spend the rest of my life carrying that truth." He paused, letting it settle. "If we continue to treat access to care as a privilege instead of a responsibility," he said, "then we are not healers, we are gatekeepers." Silence followed. Whitman sat down, exhausted. That night, alone in his room, Whitman placed a hand over his abdomen. Beneath it beat a heart supported by a liver that once belonged to another man, a man who had asked for help and been denied. "I won't waste this," Whitman said aloud. He didn't know yet how he would make amends. He only knew that surviving wasn't enough. If this story is resonating with you, subscribe and leave a comment. Because in the next scene, words will turn into action, and a life saved will begin to change a system that once refused to listen. Recovery changed Dr. Andrew Whitman in ways no medical textbook had prepared him for. Physically, his body healed faster than expected. The transplant was a success. His lab numbers improved steadily. Nurses smiled when they checked his charts. Residents whispered words like remarkable and excellent prognosis. But inside, Whitman felt heavier than he ever had. Every morning, he woke before dawn, hand instinctively resting over the scar on his abdomen. It wasn't the pain that woke him. It was the awareness. A constant, unshakable presence reminding him that his breath, his strength, his future had been purchased with another man's end. Elijah Carter was gone, and Whitman was still here. When he was discharged, the hospital arranged a quiet exit. No press, no announcements. Just a wheelchair, a nod from staff, and doors sliding open to the Los Angeles sunlight. Outside, the city looked the same. That unsettled him most. At home, Whitman's house felt too large, too clean, too empty. He wandered from room to room, unable to settle. The refrigerator was full, the lights worked, the water ran hot, privileges he had never questioned. He sat at the kitchen table and opened Elijah's file again. Not the medical chart this time. The life details, employment history, emergency contacts, none listed. A note from a social worker. Patient lives alone. Limited support network. Whitman closed his eyes. He imagined Elijah taking the bus home from the hospital, discharge papers folded in his pocket. Imagined the pain he must have carried back into that small apartment. Imagined how many nights he'd worked through nausea because missing a shift meant missing rent. Whitman pressed his hands together, knuckles white. "I saw you," he whispered into the empty room, "and I still let you go." The guilt did not soften with time. It sharpened. 2 weeks later, Whitman returned to St. Mark's Medical Center, not as a patient, not yet as a physician. He walked the halls slowly, staff stepping aside instinctively, unsure how to treat him now. He asked to see the emergency department. The same ER, the same pale blue walls, the same hum of machines. He stopped in front of the spot where Elijah's gurney had been. A nurse passed by, then froze. "Dr. Whitman," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied. She hesitated. "I remember him, the patient you discharged." Whitman nodded. "So do I." Her eyes filled slightly. "We tried to speak up. But the system," Whitman finished. She nodded. That afternoon, Whitman requested a meeting with hospital administration. The boardroom was filled with familiar faces, executives, department heads, compliance officers. They greeted him politely, cautiously. Whitman didn't sit. "I won't take long," he said, "but I won't soften this." Silence fell. "I am alive because of a man this hospital failed," Whitman continued. "A man we turned away because his insurance didn't meet requirements. That man later became my organ donor." Several people shifted uncomfortably. "I was part of that failure," Whitman said, "and I will not continue in leadership unless something changes." A board member cleared his throat. Whitman, we sympathize deeply, but this isn't about sympathy, Whitman interrupted. It's about accountability. He laid out his demands: a review of all discharge policies tied to insurance status, an emergency care override for critical cases regardless of coverage, a hospital-funded bridge program for uninsured patients with life-threatening conditions. If these changes aren't implemented, Whitman said calmly, I will resign, and I will make it public why. The room was silent. They knew his reputation. They knew the story could not survive daylight. We'll discuss this, the hospital director said carefully. Whitman nodded. Do. Quickly. That evening, Whitman visited the county clinic Elijah had been referred to. He sat in the waiting room, watching patients clutch paperwork, eyes tired, bodies slumped. This was where Elijah had been told to wait 6 weeks. Whitman spoke with staff, with administrators, with social workers. He listened, really listened, and what he heard broke him again and again. The delays, the understaffing, the quiet despair of people falling through cracks no one wanted to see. He left the clinic with a resolve that felt heavier than any oath he had taken. Weeks later, the hospital announced changes, quietly at first. New emergency funding, policy revisions, a pilot program for uninsured critical patients. The press didn't know why, but the staff did. And then Whitman did something no one expected. He resigned as department chair. He remained a physician, but stepped down from power. Instead, he founded a nonprofit partnership between SE, Marks, and county clinics designed to fast-track patients like Elijah, patients who didn't have time to wait. He named it the Carter Initiative. When asked why, Whitman answered simply, because he paid for this with his life. At night, Whitman still struggled to sleep. The guilt never vanished, but it transformed, no longer paralyzing, no longer silent. It pushed him. He visited medical schools, speaking not as an authority, but as a warning. Protocols protect systems, he told students, but they don't always protect people. Every word carried weight, because every breath he took was borrowed. If this story is moving you, subscribe and stay with us. Leave a comment if you believe accountability should follow power, because in the next scene, we'll see how one life, ended too soon, begins to change many others, and how redemption is measured not in apologies, but in action. The first patient to enter the Carter Initiative did not know Elijah Carter's name. She was a 40-year-old woman with 2 jobs and no insurance, clutching her chest as she sat in the emergency department waiting area. Her condition was critical. Under the old system, she would have been stabilized, discharged, and told to wait. This time, she wasn't. A social worker stepped in. Paperwork was bypassed. Specialists were called. Treatment began immediately. For Dr. Andrew Whitman, that moment mattered more than any press release could have. He stood in the observation corridor, hands in his coat pockets, watching quietly. No white coat, no authority badge, just a physician who understood what it meant to arrive too late. "This is why you did it," a nurse said beside him. Whitman nodded. This is why he did it. Elijah's name began appearing in places it never had before, not in headlines, but in policies, protocols, and procedures. A line added to emergency guidelines, a note in intake systems, a reminder during staff training. Not enough to erase the past, enough to disrupt the future. Whitman spent his days moving between hospitals and clinics, bridging conversations that had once been separated by hierarchy. He sat with administrators who spoke in budgets and with patients who spoke in pain. He listened to both. At a county clinic in South Los Angeles, a young man recognized him. "You're the doctor who got that transplant," the man said. Whitman hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." The man studied him carefully. "They said you change things here." Whitman shook his head. I didn't. Someone else did. The man frowned. Who? Whitman met his eyes. A man named Elijah. That night, Whitman returned home exhausted. He opened a small wooden box he kept on his desk. Inside was Elijah's bus pass, donated to the initiative by hospital staff after his death. Whitman held it between his fingers. You're still getting people where they need to go, he murmured. Across the city, the ripple spread. Emergency physicians began pushing back against automatic discharges. Residents questioned protocols they had once followed without thought. Social workers gained authority in rooms where they had once been ignored. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to matter. Whitman was invited to speak at a national medical ethics conference. He stood behind the podium, hands steady, voice clear. I used to believe the system was neutral, he told the room, that it treated everyone equally if they met the criteria. He paused. I was wrong. Systems reflect the values of those who operate them. He told Elijah's story without embellishment, without excuses. When he finished, the room was silent. Afterward, a young doctor approached him, eyes wet. What would you do differently, she asked, if you could go back? Whitman didn't hesitate. I would have seen the person before the policy. The Carter Initiative expanded quietly. Other hospitals adopted similar bridge programs, not because of pressure, but because staff who had watched Elijah's story unfold refused to let it be ignored. A small plaque appeared in the transplant wing at St. Mark's. Elijah Carter, 1989 to 2023. He gave life so others could live. Whitman stopped there every time he walked the corridor. He never stayed long. He didn't believe Elijah belonged to the past. One evening, Whitman sat alone in the ER, on a bench, not behind a desk. A man sat beside him, pale, clutching paperwork. They told me I might not qualify, the man said quietly. Whitman turned to him. What's your name? Marcus. Whitman extended his hand. I'm Andrew. No titles, no hierarchy. Marcus, Whitman said, you're not invisible here. The man nodded, tears threatening. In that moment, Whitman felt the scar on his abdomen ache faintly, not in pain, but in reminder. The system would never be perfect, but it would never be the same. If this story has stayed with you, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments, because in the final scene, we will return to the place where it all began and see how one life, denied care, ultimately reshaped the meaning of it. The plaque was small. Most people walked past it without stopping. It sat on the wall just outside the transplant unit at St. Mark's Medical Center, polished bronze catching the light in a quiet, unassuming way. Elijah Carter, 1989 to 2023. His life saved others. Every morning, Dr. Andrew Whitman stopped there, not out of habit, out of necessity. He stood in front of it now, one hand resting unconsciously over the scar beneath his shirt. The hospital was alive behind him. Footsteps, voices, the steady rhythm of a place that never truly rested. But here, in this narrow stretch of hallway, time slowed. Elijah had never asked for a plaque. He hadn't asked for recognition, or gratitude, or forgiveness. He had asked for help, and been turned away. And yet, in the end, he had given more than most people ever would. Whitman closed his eyes. I remember your face now, he whispered. I didn't then, but I do now. The Carter Initiative had been running for nearly 2 years. In that time, hundreds of patients had received emergency care regardless of insurance status. Lives had been stabilized. Time had been bought, sometimes just enough, sometimes long enough. Every success came with a shadow, because every success reminded Whitman of the one that hadn't come in time. He walked into the emergency department and joined the morning briefing. Residents listened closely when he spoke now, not because of his title, but because of his story. "We treat the person first," Whitman said. "The paperwork comes later." A resident raised her hand. "What if administration pushes back?" Whitman met her gaze. "Then they answer to me." The young doctor nodded, reassured. Later that afternoon, Whitman sat with a family in a quiet room. Their teenage son lay in critical condition down the hall. They were terrified, overwhelmed, clutching each other as if letting go might shatter them. "We don't have good insurance," the mother said, voice trembling. "They told us," Whitman interrupted gently. "Your son is being treated, fully, right now." The father exhaled, shoulders sagging as tears fell freely. "Thank you," he whispered. Whitman shook his head. "You don't need to thank me." He knew who they were thanking. That evening, Whitman walked out of the hospital into the warm Los Angeles air. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in orange and gold. He stood for a moment, letting the light wash over him. He was alive. That fact no longer felt like a victory. It felt like a responsibility. At home, Whitman prepared a simple dinner and ate alone at the kitchen table. He no longer filled the silence with television or work emails. He let it be what it was. Sometimes, silence was where the truth lived. He opened his laptop and reviewed the latest Carter Initiative report. More hospitals had joined. More clinics had adopted the model. Not enough. Never enough. But it was moving. He closed the laptop and leaned back, eyes drifting to the window. He imagined Elijah on a bus somewhere, discharge papers folded in his pocket. Imagined the strength it must have taken to keep going when the system told him he didn't matter. And he imagined Elijah signing those donor forms, not knowing who would receive them, not knowing the impact, not knowing that his life would force a man like Andrew Whitman to finally see. Whitman stood and walked to a small shelf in his living room. There, among medical books and framed certificates he no longer displayed prominently, sat a simple object. Elijah's bus pass. Whitman picked it up, running his thumb over the worn edges. "You didn't get the care you deserved," he said quietly, "but you changed it." The next morning, a new patient arrived in the ER. Another man, another story, another moment where a decision could tip the balance. This time, the system didn't hesitate. This time, no one was told to wait. Whitman watched from the corridor as care began immediately. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, not pain, but memory. Elijah was gone. But Elijah was everywhere. If you're listening to this story right now, remember this. Systems don't change because they're asked to. They change because someone pays the price. Elijah Carter paid that price with his life, and because of that, countless others would not have to. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Because stories like this aren't about villains or heroes, they're about choices. And sometimes, the quietest choices leave the loudest legacy.